Under the bright lights of the grand ballroom, laughter echoed off the crystal chandeliers. The millionaire, a man known for his arrogance and wealth, stood at the center of attention. He wore a smug smile as he raised his glass and spoke loudly to his circle of equally wealthy friends. He loved these nights when every guest admired his fortune and power. It was not enough for him to be rich. He also needed others to see it, to feel it, and to know that he was above them. Servants hurried about with trays of food and drinks, careful not to bump into anyone or make the slightest mistake. The millionaire's young maid, Maria, was among them. She moved quietly, head lowered, serving with grace but never drawing attention to herself. She was dressed plainly, in a uniform too simple for the lavish event. To most guests, she was invisible, just another shadow in the background of luxury. But to the millionaire, she was the perfect target for a little cruel amusement. He enjoyed reminding people of their place, and humiliating his servants gave him a twisted sense of power. That night, as the piano stood polished in the corner of the room, he suddenly had an idea that made his lips curl into a wicked grin. He turned toward Maria and called her name in a booming voice that made the room fall silent. The maid froze in her steps. Nearly dropping the tray in her hands, all eyes shifted toward her, curious why the host had spoken to a servant during such an elegant gathering. The millionaire pointed toward the piano and said mockingly, "Why don't you give us a performance, Maria? Surely you know how to play, don't you?" His words dripped with sarcasm, and his friends chuckled at the absurd suggestion. The guests began whispering among themselves. Some laughed openly, imagining the poor maid fumbling at the keys. Others leaned closer, excited to see how far the humiliation would go. Maria's cheeks burned red, and she wanted to disappear into the floor. She had never asked for attention, never tried to stand out. Her duty was to work quietly, not to entertain a ballroom full of strangers. But the millionaire would not let her go. He raised his voice again. "Go on. Show us your talent." His friends clapped mockingly, chanting for her to play. They did not care whether she could or not. To them, it was just another joke, another way to laugh at someone beneath them. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. Her hands shook as she set down the tray and slowly walked toward the piano. The sound of her shoes on the polished floor felt like thunder in her ears. Each step felt heavier than the last, and she could feel the eyes of every guest piercing through her. Her mind screamed to run away, to refuse, but she knew that would only anger the millionaire and bring her more shame. When she finally reached the piano, she stood before it like a prisoner before judgment. The room was filled with silence now, waiting, watching, anticipating her failure. The millionaire leaned back in his chair with his smug grin, whispering to his friends that this would be the highlight of the evening. They laughed, confident that the poor maid would embarrass herself and give them a story to tell for weeks. Maria looked down at the shining keys. Her reflection stared back at her, frightened and unsure. She could hear the whispers behind her, feel the weight of the mockery pressing down. She remembered her father, who had once told her, "Never let others decide your worth, Maria." The memory gave her a small spark of courage, but it was buried beneath layers of fear. She sat on the piano bench, her back straight but her hands trembling. The guests leaned forward, some holding back laughter already, waiting for her to strike the wrong notes. The millionaire raised his glass once more, his smile wide with satisfaction. For him, this was power, forcing a maid into the spotlight only to watch her fail. He was certain she had never touched a piano before in her life. The room was ready for her humiliation. But inside Maria's chest, a storm of emotions was building. She felt fear, yes, but also a quiet defiance. The cruelty of the moment pressed her down, yet at the same time, something deep within whispered that she was not as small as they believed. That whisper was faint, but it refused to die. As her fingers hovered above the keys, the entire ballroom held its breath. The millionaire smirked, the guests leaned in, and Maria's heart raced faster than it ever had before. This was the moment when the mockery was supposed to begin. But in truth, it was the moment when everything was about to change. Maria sat on the piano bench, her heart pounding so hard it felt as if everyone in the room could hear it. The guests waited for her to make a fool of herself. They whispered and laughed, already sure that a poor maid could never touch the keys properly. But Maria's eyes did not stay on the people around her. Instead, they drifted toward the piano. And in that polished surface she saw not just her reflection, but also a memory of the past, a memory she carried deep in her heart. Long before she had become a maid in the mansion, Maria had been a little girl in a small village. Her family was poor, but her father had been a kind and gentle man. Though he had little money, he had a passion for music. In their small wooden house he had kept an old second-hand piano. It was scratched and out of tune, but to Maria, it was a treasure. She would sit beside him for hours. Watching his hands glide across the keys, he would laugh and say, "Music is the voice of the heart, Maria, and one day you will find your voice through it too." Her father had been her first teacher. His calloused hands gently guided her small fingers to the right notes. Sometimes she would make mistakes and frown, but he always smiled. "Every wrong note brings you closer to the right one," he would say. In those moments, the world outside, the hunger, the poverty, the struggles, disappeared. The piano was their escape, a door to something beautiful beyond their hard lives. But those days had ended far too soon. Her father had fallen ill, a sickness that no doctor in their village could heal. Maria remembered sitting by his side. His hand weak but still warm, he whispered his last words to her. "Promise me you will never let go of the music inside you. Promise me, Maria." And she had promised, through tears, clutching his hand as tightly as she could. After his death, the piano in their home fell silent. There was no one to play it, and soon after, it was sold to pay for food. Life had forced Maria to grow up quickly. Her mother could not manage alone, so Maria found work wherever she could. She scrubbed floors, washed clothes, and later became a maid in the mansion of the millionaire. She never complained, though. Her father's words were still in her heart. Every time she felt small, she remembered him saying, "Music is your voice," but in the mansion, surrounded by wealth and arrogance, she kept her voice hidden. She never told anyone she could play. She never touched the piano in the ballroom, afraid of being laughed at, afraid of being told that a maid had no right to such beauty. And now here she was, forced to face the very thing she had buried inside her. The piano stood before her like an old friend, silent, waiting. Her hands trembled as she hovered them above the keys. Her father's memory flooded her mind. His warm smile, his encouragement, his belief in her. She could almost hear him whisper again, "Every wrong note brings you closer to the right one. Do not fear it." Behind her, the laughter of the guests grew sharper. Some of them mocked her posture. Others whispered that she didn't even know where to start. The millionaire leaned back in his chair with a grin, whispering to his friends, "Watch, she'll strike a key like a hammer. This will be fun." His arrogance filled the air. But Maria let her mind drift away from him. She thought of her father's hands, his calm guidance and her promise. Her heart still pounded, but a strange calmness began to rise inside her. She realized that she wasn't just a maid being mocked in front of a crowd. She was her father's daughter, a girl who once believed in music. She had been silent for too long, and maybe this was her moment to speak without words. She closed her eyes, blocking out the cruel faces around her. In that silence, she was back in her village, sitting beside her father. The old piano was there. The room smelled of wood and smoke from the small stove. She remembered laughing at her own clumsy fingers, and her father laughing with her. The memory made her lips curve into the faintest smile. She placed her fingers on the keys, not for the millionaire, not for the crowd, but for him. The guests were restless now. Some rolled their eyes, waiting for the humiliation to begin. Others leaned forward, curious. Maria could feel their stares, but her focus was elsewhere. She whispered softly under her breath, "This is for you, Papa." The weight of her past pressed down on her, but it also gave her strength. Every sacrifice, every tear, every night she spent working instead of sleeping. It all built inside her like a river ready to burst. She was no longer just a maid, no longer just a poor girl meant to serve. She was a daughter honoring a promise. The silence in the ballroom stretched. Guests exchanged impatient looks. The millionaire tapped his glass, smirking, but Maria kept her eyes closed, holding on to the memory. She knew the moment her fingers pressed the keys, everything would change. Either she would be humiliated, or she would finally let her father's gift live again. Her breathing slowed. Her hands stopped trembling. She felt the cool surface of the ivory keys beneath her fingertips. In that single instant, it was as though time itself paused. The crowd leaned in. The millionaire's grin widened, and Maria, the maid who had been forced into the spotlight, was ready to turn her pain into music. Maria sat at the piano, her fingers lightly resting on the keys. The silence in the grand ballroom was heavy. Every guest was waiting, not with kindness, but with hungry eyes eager to see her fail. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, a glass of wine in his hand. His smirk showed his confidence that this would end in laughter and shame. To him it was a game, and Maria was the piece he controlled. The whispers began again, sharp and cruel. "She doesn't even know where to begin," one guest muttered. Another chuckled. "Look at her hands, trembling like a leaf. She'll press the wrong note in seconds." Their laughter spread like fire, filling the air with mockery. Maria could hear every word, and each one felt like a stone thrown at her heart. Her face burned with embarrassment, and she wanted to stand up and run. Yet something deep inside her refused. Her father's words still echoed in her memory. "Do not fear mistakes, child. Play with your heart." The pressure was unbearable. She could feel the weight of every stare on her back. The chandelier above sparkled, throwing golden light on her small figure at the piano. The rich gowns and jewels around her glittered. But Maria sat in a plain uniform, fragile and exposed. The contrast made her humiliation sharper. The millionaire enjoyed it. He leaned toward his guests and whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "This will be the shortest concert in history." His friends laughed so hard that one nearly spilled his drink. Maria's breath grew faster. Her hands shook as she tried to steady them. Her chest ached as if she could not breathe. She was no stranger to hard work or cruel words, but this was different. This was not just cleaning floors or carrying trays. This was standing in front of the most powerful people in the city with nothing but a piano, and they wanted her to break. They wanted her to be small. She looked around once, and everywhere she saw ridicule. Some guests covered their mouths, waiting to laugh. Others leaned forward with mocking curiosity. A few even shook their heads as if saying, "What a foolish girl." The sound of their whispers swirled around her like a storm. She clenched her teeth, and in that storm a spark of anger rose. Why should she let them decide who she was? Why should their laughter take away what her father had given her? Maria closed her eyes tightly, shutting the world out. She told herself she was not in the ballroom anymore. She was not surrounded by cruel strangers. She was not a maid under orders. She was a little girl again in her village, sitting on the old stool beside her father. She could almost feel his hand resting gently on hers. Guiding her, she heard his calm voice saying, "Every wrong note leads to the right one. Trust yourself, Maria," the whispers continued, but now they sounded far away like distant noise. The millionaire tapped his glass against the table impatiently. "Any day now," he said with a grin. His guests chuckled. Some even pretended to clap already, mocking the performance that hadn't begun. Maria's lips pressed together in determination. She inhaled deeply, letting the memory of her father's voice become louder than the crowd. Her fingers lowered slightly. The first touch of the cool ivory keys sent a shiver through her body. For a moment, she almost pulled back, afraid of the sound that might come. Her fear told her she would hit the wrong note and give the crowd what they wanted. But another voice inside her pushed her forward. It was her father's promise. It was her own hidden strength. It was the music she had buried for so many years. Her hands trembled, but she pressed one key. The soft note rang out, fragile yet clear. The room instantly fell into silence. The guests who had been laughing stopped mid-sentence. Some tilted their heads, surprised that she had even dared to begin. The millionaire raised his eyebrows but kept his smirk, convinced she would stumble any second. Maria's heart raced, but that first note gave her courage. It was small, but it was hers. She placed her other hand on the keys and pressed again. This time the sound carried a little longer. The whispers had stopped completely now. Replaced with curiosity, the crowd leaned closer. Expecting the next mistake, Maria felt their eyes. But she focused on the keys. Her father's smile filled her mind. His laughter, his encouragement, his warmth, they became her shield. Every second she held on, the pressure grew heavier. It was not just a piano anymore. It was a battlefield. And every key she touched was a stand against the humiliation they had planned for her. The millionaire sipped his wine, his eyes fixed on her, ready to enjoy her collapse. But Maria was not collapsing. She was trembling, yes, but she was still there. Still holding on, her breaths came faster. Her chest rose and fell as if she had run a long distance. Sweat formed on her brow. Yet she did not lift her hands from the piano. She kept them steady, ready to let the next note fall. The silence in the room grew unbearable. Guests exchanged glances, some impatient, others strangely tense. They had wanted laughter, but something else was happening. Something none of them had expected, Maria whispered softly under her breath, so low only she could hear. "For you, Papa." Her voice steadied her, and the tremor in her hands began to fade. The pressure was still there, but now she was standing taller inside. She was not just a maid in that moment. She was a daughter fulfilling a promise. She was a girl with music in her heart. As the last whisper in the crowd died away, Maria finally opened her eyes. They were no longer wide with fear. They carried a quiet strength. Her fingers moved into position on the piano. She was ready, the millionaire smirked. The crowd waited, and Maria, against all their expectations, was about to let her voice speak through the music she had kept hidden for so long. Maria's fingers rested on the piano keys. The silence in the ballroom was so deep that even the flicker of the chandelier seemed louder than the air. The guests leaned forward, waiting. Some were eager to laugh, others curious, and the millionaire sipped his wine with a smirk, confident the moment would end in disaster. But Maria closed her eyes and drew a slow breath, letting the noise of the crowd vanish from her mind. Her hands pressed down and the first notes floated out. They were soft, trembling, uncertain, but they carried something real. The laughter that had been ready to erupt never came. Instead, a hush fell over the guests. Some blinked in surprise, expecting chaos but hearing a fragile melody instead. Maria's heart still raced, but as her fingers moved to the next keys, she felt a warmth spreading through her. It was the warmth of memories, of nights when her father had played for her in their small home. The first few notes wavered like a bird unsure if it could fly. Her hands shook, and for a moment she almost stumbled. Her mind screamed, "They're waiting for you to fail," but then, as she pressed the next set of keys, something changed. Her fingers began to remember the patterns. The music, buried inside her for so long, stirred awake. It was as if her father's spirit was guiding her hand. Steadying her trembling fingers, the melody grew clearer, fuller. Filling the vast ballroom, the crowd leaned in even more, their mocking grins fading slowly into confusion. This was not the sound of a maid banging at the keys. This was music, real music, carrying emotion. The millionaire's smirk faltered for the first time. He sat up straighter, his wineglass frozen in his hand. Maria's breathing calmed as the music flowed. Each note she played felt like a step back into her childhood. She remembered sitting beside her father on the old stool, their laughter echoing in their tiny house. She remembered how he would clap for her even when she pressed the wrong notes, telling her she was born to play. Those memories wrapped around her now, protecting her from the cruel eyes in the room. Her father's voice whispered in her mind, "Play with your heart, not your fear." Her music shifted, becoming stronger, smoother. The melody rose, carrying not only sound but feelings. Feelings of love, loss, hope, and longing. The ballroom, once filled with chatter and laughter, had grown completely silent. Guests forgot to sip their drinks or whisper. Their eyes were fixed on the young maid, who just moments ago had been the target of their jokes. Now she was transforming into something else before their very eyes. The chandeliers above seemed to shimmer in rhythm with the sound. The polished marble floor reflected the glow of candlelight, as if even the room itself leaned closer to listen. Maria's fingers no longer trembled. They danced across the keys, graceful and sure. The strength in her music came from every hardship she had endured. Her father's death, her mother's tears, her siblings' hunger, the long days of labor. Everything poured out through her hands. At the back of the room, a woman gasped quietly. A man wiped his eye before pretending it was only dust. No one laughed anymore, not even the cruelest of guests. Instead, they were captivated. Their expressions softened, their breath slowed. They had come expecting to see a maid humiliated, but instead they were witnessing a soul speak in the language of music. The millionaire's smirk was gone now, replaced with confusion. He had wanted a performance to mock, but he was seeing something he had not prepared for. His chest felt tight, though he did not understand why. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the glass. Maria's music was reaching him, breaking through the wall of arrogance he had built for years. Maria did not see the crowd anymore. She did not see the millionaire or the glittering gowns or the sparkling jewels. She only saw the piano and the music flowing out of it. Her eyes stayed closed, tears forming at the corners, not from fear but from the emotion pouring through her. She was no longer a maid in that moment. She was a pianist, she was her father's daughter, keeping her promise. The notes filled every corner of the room, rising and falling like waves. Some guests held their breath, afraid to break the spell. Others leaned so close their chairs creaked, but no one dared to speak. The music had silenced them. Not by force but by beauty. It carried weight, it carried truth, and it carried a power none of them expected. Maria's fingers flew now, not with clumsiness but with confidence. Her back straightened, her head lifted slightly, and for the first time that night she felt free. She was not playing for the millionaire or his guests. She was playing for her father, for her family, and for herself. Every note told her story. Every sound carried her pain and her hope. When she finally let her hands fall into a softer passage, the music wrapped the room in tenderness. It was like a lullaby, soothing and gentle. The guests looked at one another, their faces changed, their laughter long forgotten in that moment. Maria held the entire ballroom in her hands. The millionaire swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. He had invited the maid to the piano to make her small, but instead, she had filled the entire space with something greater than his wealth. For the first time in many years, he did not feel powerful. He felt humbled. Maria continued, each note more sure, more alive. The trembling girl who had sat down moments before was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who refused to be broken. The music carried her higher, and with every passing second, she pulled the crowd with her. When the last soft notes of that section faded, the room stayed silent. No one clapped yet, no one moved. They were caught in the spell of her music. The silence was not mocking anymore. It was reverence, it was awe, and in that silence, Maria prepared to pour even more of her soul into the piano, ready to show them all the truth of who she really was. Maria's fingers moved faster now, no longer timid, no longer unsure. The music that came from the piano was not just sound. It was emotion, it was anger, sorrow, love, and hope all woven together into a melody that seemed too powerful for a poor maid. The guests who had once laughed sat frozen in their seats, their eyes wide. Their glasses of wine stood untouched, their whispers silenced. Every note she played felt like a story. The soft parts spoke of nights when she and her family had gone to bed hungry. The sharp, strong notes carried the memory of her father's death. The flowing passages told of her long days of work and her secret dreams that had never died. The room was no longer a ballroom filled with rich people. It had become a place where Maria's soul spoke openly for the first time. Her eyes stayed closed, her tears slipped down her cheeks, but her hands never faltered. She remembered her mother's tired face as she worked late into the night. She remembered her younger siblings, their small hands reaching out to her when they were scared. She remembered the promise she had made to her father on his deathbed. Every piece of her life, every wound, every little hope, flowed into the piano. The guests could feel it. Their bodies leaned forward as if pulled by invisible strings. One woman clutched her chest. Another man wiped his eye, afraid others would see. The music reached into them, stirring feelings they had long buried beneath pride and wealth. For the first time in many years, they were not thinking of riches or power. They were thinking of their own childhoods, of their parents, of love and loss. The chandeliers seemed to glow brighter, reflecting the rhythm of her music. The marble floor carried the sound, and the walls themselves vibrated as if they too wanted to listen. Maria's plain uniform no longer looked like a servant's dress. Under the golden light, she seemed almost like a performer meant for the grandest stage. Her hands danced with grace and fire, each movement precise yet filled with passion. The millionaire shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His smug grin was gone completely. He had wanted laughter. He had wanted to humiliate her, but instead, he was watching her control the room in a way he never could. His friends glanced at him, waiting to see if he would make another cruel remark, but he said nothing. He was too caught in the storm of the music. Inside him, something stirred, something he had locked away long ago. He remembered being a boy, sitting in a small house not much bigger than Maria's. He remembered his mother singing to him at night. He remembered the hunger, the struggle, the pain. For years he had buried those memories under gold and arrogance, but Maria's music ripped them out again. He felt his chest ache in a way he had not felt for decades. Maria's melody swelled, her hands moved quickly now, building waves of sound that crashed through the ballroom. The crowd was swept into it, powerless to resist. They had come expecting a simple joke, but now they sat in awe. They could no longer see a maid. They only saw a girl pouring her heart into the piano, commanding their respect with nothing but music. Her face glistened with sweat, her shoulders tense with effort. But she did not stop. Each note gave her more strength. She felt as though her father stood behind her, his hands guiding hers, his voice whispering encouragement. The weight she had carried for years seemed to lift with each sound she played. Her father's promise, her mother's struggles, her siblings' hungry nights, all of it was released in the music. The guests were silent. But their silence was not cruel anymore, it was reverence. They felt as though they were witnessing something sacred. Some of them had heard great performers before, but none of them had ever felt music like this. It was raw, it was real, and it was unforgettable. The millionaire's eyes burned. He blinked quickly, but the sting of tears only grew stronger. He clenched his jaw, fighting it, but the music pressed deeper into him, tearing down his pride. Each note reminded him of what he had lost when he had chosen money over humanity. His fingers trembled against his glass, and he finally set it down, unable to pretend he was unaffected. Maria leaned into the final part of the piece, her fingers blurred with speed, striking the keys with a strength that no one expected. The music filled the room like a storm at sea, powerful, unstoppable. Her tears dripped onto the keys, mixing with the sound. Her whole body moved with the rhythm. She was not playing anymore, she was living. She was shouting her story without words, and everyone in that ballroom heard it. The music rose to its highest point. Soaring, fierce, the crowd held their breath. Their hearts pounded in rhythm with hers, no one dared to move. Even the air seemed to hold still as the sound reached its peak. Then slowly, Maria let the notes soften. Her hands moved gently now, guiding the music into calm. The storm quieted, replaced by something tender. Her last few notes floated like whispers through the ballroom, soft, delicate, and full of love. When the final sound faded, the silence returned. But it was not the silence of mockery. It was the silence of awe. The guests sat frozen, unable to clap, unable to speak. Their eyes shone with tears they did not want to admit. Maria lifted her hands from the keys. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. Her eyes opened slowly, shining with tears. She looked down at the piano, her father's promise alive in every note she had played. For a long moment, the ballroom stayed completely still. Everyone was caught in the spell she had cast, and in that silence, Maria knew she had spoken louder than any cruel word ever could. The final notes of Maria's music still hung in the air like a whisper that refused to fade. The ballroom remained silent, so silent that even the crackle of the candles could be heard. The guests sat frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open. No one dared to move. No one dared to break the spell that had been cast. The maid they had mocked had turned into something else before their eyes. She had become a storyteller, and her piano had spoken truths they could never laugh at. Maria's chest rose and fell as she breathed heavily. Her fingers were still resting on the keys, trembling not from fear, but from the intensity of what she had just poured out. Tears streaked down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. She kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, listening to the silence she had created. That silence felt louder than any applause. It was proof that her music had reached them. At the head of the table, the millionaire shifted in his seat. His wineglass stood forgotten. His smirk was long gone. His lips were pressed tightly together as though he was fighting against something. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, and his chest rose and fell unevenly. For years, he had believed himself untouchable, above emotion, above weakness, but now, in front of everyone, he felt the wall around his heart cracking. The music had forced him to remember. He saw his own childhood flash before his eyes. He remembered being a poor boy in a broken house. He remembered nights when he had gone to bed hungry. He remembered his mother humming softly to comfort him when there was no food. He remembered his father's tired hands working late into the night. He had promised himself long ago that he would escape that life. He had sworn that he would bury his pain under riches and pride, and he had done it. He had built walls of gold and arrogance so tall that nothing could touch him. But Maria's music had climbed over those walls and found him. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold it back, but his eyes burned. The tears pushed against him, and no matter how hard he fought, they slipped through. One rolled down his cheek and then another. His guests saw it. Their host, the powerful man who laughed at others' misery, was crying. It was not the loud sobbing of a broken man. It was the quiet, unwilling surrender of someone who had been forced to remember what it felt like to be human. Maria opened her eyes at last and lifted her hands from the keys. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room. She saw faces she had once feared, faces twisted by mockery earlier. Now softened, some guests looked away, ashamed of their earlier laughter. Others stared at her with something close to admiration. But then her eyes stopped on the millionaire. For a moment she almost did not believe what she saw. The man who had forced her to the piano, who had tried to humiliate her, sat there with tears shining in his eyes. He was staring at her as though he could not understand what had just happened. His chest rose and fell as if he had run a great distance. His pride was broken and his arrogance was slipping through his fingers. The crowd noticed and whispers began to spread again. But these whispers were not cruel. They were filled with shock. "He's crying," one guest murmured. "I've never seen him cry," another said in disbelief. The mighty millionaire, who prided himself on power, had been undone by the very maid he had tried to humiliate. Maria lowered her head slightly. She did not smile, she did not gloat. She was too overwhelmed by what she had just done. She had not played to shame him. She had played to keep her father's promise alive. She had played for her family, for herself, yet, seeing the tears on his face filled her with something unexpected, not triumph, but a strange, quiet victory. The millionaire reached for his glass, but his hand trembled too much to hold it steady. He set it back down and pressed his palm to his face. His shoulders hunched slightly, his pride slipping further away. The guests did not laugh at him. They could not. They too had been touched by the music. They understood what it had done to him because it had done the same to them. It had stripped away their masks and shown them pieces of themselves they had buried. Maria sat still, her hands folded in her lap now. Her body exhausted, her spirit raw. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her. But she no longer feared them. She had given them everything she had. She had nothing left to hide. In that moment she was not a maid. She was a daughter who had kept her promise, a girl who had shared her soul. The millionaire's tears fell silently, one after another. His chest tightened with every memory her music had awakened. He thought of his mother's tired smile, of his father's calloused hands, of the hunger that had shaped him for so long. He had buried it under money and pride, but Maria's music had torn the ground open, and now he could no longer ignore it. He realized, with a pain that cut deep, that the maid he had mocked was stronger than he had ever been. The ballroom remained silent, no applause yet, no words. Only the sight of the powerful man undone and the young maid sitting quietly at the piano. The spell of the moment was not broken, and in that silence something began to change inside him, something he had thought was lost forever. For the first time in years he felt humble. For the first time in years he felt small, not in a way that crushed him, but in a way that reminded him he was human. And as he sat there, tears streaming down his face, he realized the truth. The maid had not been humiliated, he had, and yet, it was not humiliation he felt, it was gratitude. Gratitude for being reminded that he still had a heart. The silence in the ballroom stretched long after Maria's final note had faded. It was not the silence of mockery, not the silence of boredom, but the heavy silence of awe. Every guest sat still, caught between disbelief and wonder. The chandeliers glittered above, but no one looked up at them. All eyes were fixed on the young maid sitting at the piano, her face shining with tears and exhaustion. For a moment, no one moved. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath. Then slowly a sound broke the stillness. It was a single clap, sharp and loud. It came from the far side of the room where one of the older guests stood. His eyes were wet, his hand steady as he clapped again. The sound echoed. And suddenly another person joined, then another, until the silence shattered into a thunderstorm of applause. The ballroom roared with clapping and cheering. Guests rose to their feet. Their faces no longer wore cruel smiles but expressions of deep respect. Some had tears running down their cheeks, others shouted "Bravo!" with voices that cracked from emotion. The same people who had laughed at her just moments ago were now standing tall, clapping as if their lives depended on it. Maria blinked, startled by the eruption of sound. For a second she thought she was dreaming. The same crowd that had mocked her was cheering for her. The same faces that had waited for her humiliation were now lit with admiration. Her lips trembled. Her hands shook. She could barely believe it. She had not expected applause. She had not expected acceptance. She had only wanted to honor her father's memory. The applause grew louder. Guests stamped their feet. Chairs scraped back as more people stood. The ballroom shook with the force of their ovation. Some guests leaned over the piano to praise her. Others called her name. Maria, who had always moved silently through these halls as a servant, was now being celebrated like a star. Her tears spilled freely now, not of shame but of relief and joy. She lowered her head, overwhelmed. She wanted to thank them, but no words came. Her voice was trapped in her chest, but her music had already spoken for her. She had given them her soul, and they had answered with respect. At the head of the room, the millionaire remained seated. His face was pale, his eyes red from crying. He watched his guests stand for her. He watched the maid he had tried to humiliate rise higher than him. His pride stung, but his heart knew the truth. He could not deny what he had seen and heard. His guest had not been moved by wealth, or power, or his name. They had been moved by her music, by her courage, slowly, as though weighed down by his own shame. The millionaire rose to his feet. The applause did not stop. If anything, it grew louder. The crowd turned to see him standing. They expected anger, perhaps even dismissal, but instead they saw his hands come together. He clapped for her. His face was wet with tears, his shoulders heavy, but his applause was real. Maria saw him stand, and her breath caught in her throat. She had feared him. She had hated the cruelty in his eyes. Yet here he was, clapping. His pride was broken, and in its place stood something else, respect or perhaps regret, she did not know. But it was enough to make her heart ache. The room swelled with emotion. The maid who had been invisible for so long was now the center of everything. Strangers reached for her hands, praising her. Guests begged her to play again. Some even asked where she had learned to perform like that. Maria smiled weakly, her tears still falling. She could not answer, for her voice was gone. Her heart had spoken louder than words. The ovation continued, stretching on and on. No one wanted it to end. For the first time, Maria felt truly seen. She had been a shadow in the mansion, carrying trays and scrubbing floors, but now she stood in the light. Not because she had sought it, but because her music had demanded it. Her father's promise echoed in her heart. Never let go of the music inside you. She had kept that promise, and in keeping it, she had changed everything. She had turned humiliation into triumph, pain into beauty, and silence into applause. The millionaire's friends whispered to him. Asking what he would do, he shook his head slowly. Unable to answer, his throat was tight, his heart heavier than it had ever been. But in that heaviness there was also a strange peace. He knew he could never look at her as just a maid again. He knew none of them could. Maria stood finally, her legs weak beneath her. The applause roared louder as she rose. The guests cheered and clapped until their hands hurt. She bowed slightly, not with pride but with gratitude. She bowed for her father, for her family, for every person who had ever been silenced but carried music in their hearts. And as she straightened again, she saw something she never thought she would see. The millionaire lowering his head to her, bowing not deeply but enough for everyone to see. Gasps filled the room. His bow was not just respect, it was an apology, an admission that he had been wrong. Maria's lips trembled into a soft smile, not of victory but of release. The applause carried her higher, lifting her above the pain she had endured. She was no longer just a maid, she was a musician. She was a voice that could not be silenced, and the entire ballroom knew it. The ovation thundered on, the sound of hands clapping, voices cheering, feet stamping. Maria stood at the piano, her tears shining like jewels, her heart full. She had given them her music, and in return, they had given her something she never thought possible: honor. The applause went on and on, rolling through the ballroom like thunder. Maria stood beside the piano, her hands pressed together, her head bowed. She had never imagined such a moment. For years she had been invisible, a servant who moved quietly, never noticed unless she made a mistake. Now she was the center of the room, not because of wealth or power, but because of the music inside her. At last the clapping began to slow. Guests wiped their eyes, some still shaking their heads in disbelief. They had witnessed something they would never forget. Maria looked around the room, her vision blurred with tears. She saw faces softened with respect, faces that no longer looked down on her. For the first time she felt equal to them, perhaps even greater. The millionaire stepped forward, his footsteps heavy, all eyes turned to him. The man who had tried to humiliate her, the man who had laughed as he forced her to the piano, now looked different. His face was pale, his eyes swollen with tears. His pride seemed gone. Every step he took toward her carried the weight of shame. The guests held their breath, waiting. He stopped in front of her, his voice low, broken. "Maria, forgive me." The words were simple, but in that grand hall, they sounded louder than the applause. Gasps filled the room. No one had ever heard him apologize. Not to a servant, not to anyone. He lowered his head to her, bowing slightly in front of the maid he had mocked. Maria's chest tightened. She stared at him, unable to speak. She had never expected kindness from him, never expected respect. For a long moment she stood frozen. Then she gave a small nod. It was not forgiveness for his cruelty. but it was acceptance of the moment. She had not played to shame him. She had played for her father, and her father would have wanted her to show grace. The millionaire straightened, his voice trembling as he continued. You have a gift the world must see. From this day forward, you will not work as a maid. I will sponsor your education. I will make sure you study at the finest music academy. The room erupted in whispers. Shocked by his words, some thought it was guilt. Others thought it was admiration. But all knew his promise was real. Maria's eyes widened. She covered her mouth with her hand. She could barely believe what she was hearing. Her dream, the dream she had buried deep in her heart, was suddenly alive again. The promise she had made to her father would not end here. It would grow. Her music would not be trapped in silence anymore. The guests clapped again, this time not just for her music but for the future opening before her. Several of them stepped forward, offering their support. A woman said she would introduce her to a famous pianist. A man promised to arrange performances. The same crowd that had laughed at her earlier now stood ready to lift her higher. Maria wiped her tears, her voice finally returning. Thank you, she whispered. It was all she could manage. Her heart was too full for more. She looked at the piano, her father's words echoing in her mind. Music is your voice, Maria. Let the world hear it. She knew now that his promise was truly alive. The millionaire stepped back, his face still heavy with regret, but also softer than it had ever been. He knew he could not erase what he had done, but he could change what came next. He had learned a lesson that night, a lesson that no amount of money had ever taught him. He had learned humility. Maria left the piano with her head held high. The guests moved aside for her. Some even bowed their heads in respect. She felt light, as if the chains of shame had been broken. She thought of her mother and siblings waiting at home. She imagined their faces when she told them what had happened. She imagined the joy in her mother's eyes, the hope in her siblings' laughter. In the days that followed, Maria's life changed. She was no longer just the maid in the mansion. She became a student at a prestigious academy, supported by those who had once mocked her. She studied hard, her father's voice always guiding her. Each note she played carried his memory. Each performance was her way of honoring him. Years passed and Maria became known across the city, and then across the world. Crowds gathered not to laugh but to listen. They listened because her music was pure, it was real, and it touched their hearts. People said she played not with her hands but with her soul. They did not know the full story, but they could feel it in every note. The millionaire often attended her concerts. He always sat quietly, always with his head bowed. He never again treated her with cruelty. Instead, he spoke of her with respect. He admitted to those who asked that she had taught him more than money ever could. He said that the night he tried to humiliate her was the night he himself was humbled. Maria never forgot that night in the ballroom. She never forgot the laughter, the fear, the trembling in her hands, but more importantly, she never forgot the silence that followed her first notes, the silence that turned into awe, the silence that gave way to thunderous applause. That was the night her father's promise came alive, the night her voice was finally heard, and so, the maid who had once been mocked became a pianist whose name was known everywhere. Her journey was not about revenge or pride, it was about music, about love, about keeping a promise, and in the end, her father's words had proven true. Music was her voice, and through it she touched the world.